Good morning, welcome to my channel. I'm Dr. Paul Kiritsis, and today I'm going to be giving you a short exposition on how alchemy influenced the Renaissance. Contrary to what the occult dilettante or historical romanticists may think, the esoteric undercurrent known as Hermeticism has never been a distinctly philosophical edifice in its own right. Nor has it competed for cultural prominence against the major monotheistic religions, that being Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Perhaps the best way to grasp it is to return to the cultural milieu in which it originated, the world of Greco-Roman Egypt. If Hermeticism was an equilateral triangle, the principal characteristics conferring form to each of its three corners would be revelation, secrecy, and initiation. Alternatively, one can think of the discipline as a cosmogony that acknowledges God's absolute transcendence, a reality made partially comprehensible to human beings through an intellectually stimulated and intuitively felt participation called gnosis. The obligatory oath of silence, as well as the initiatory rites, which accompanied and governed the whole endeavour, was no doubt inherited directly from the mystical Pythagorean tradition during the cross-cultural efflux that emanated from Alexandria between 300 BC and 300 CE. Following literary devices that typified the wisdom literature of the autochthonous culture, and by autochthonous I mean the Egyptian culture, Hermetic discourse was usually didactic and instructional. Teachings were usually imparted from higher moral and ethical ground by a pseudo-biographical persona, usually a semi-divine father or teacher to his pupil or son, for the purpose of realigning oneself with the salvific quest, which sought to reconcile the soul with its divine source, the sphere of the fixed stars or the empyrean of God. The philosophical and theological protoplasm brewing in Alexandria after the 3rd century BCE also generated a fusion between the ibis-headed moon god Thoth and the Hellenistic Hermes, whereby traits belonging to either one, so the invention of writing, mercurial thought, the enforcement of physical and divine law, the authorship of knowledge, as well as the mediumship between worlds, were eventually recast under the aegis of a composite Hermes Thoth. Sometime during the 2nd century onwards, the deity also acquired the epithet thrice greatest and became known as Hermes Trismegistus. This was the champion of Hermeticism, or at least the egregore, to which its adherents paid homage. Just as the moon reflects the supernal light from the sun during the nocturnal hours, so too did Hermes Trismegistus possess the minds of the literati, so that the genealogy of primordial knowledge would be transcribed onto parchments of papyrus, or so they thought. What made a text Hermetic wasn't the philosophical or theological tradition to which it adhered, but rather an outright appeal to the Egyptian sage himself, and a conviction that the primordial knowledge, which by some lamentable lapse was lost some time ago, had existed for time immemorial. Therefore, the authenticity and validity of the Hermetic institution was precariously hinged on emphatic claims that were fabricated and bounded into legitimation legends before being inserted into texts for the sole purpose of perpetuating that conviction. Moreover, they all advocated the same animistic and vitalistic perspective. So the divine, which can anatomically be divided into physical and paraphysical elements, infuses all levels of creation. So in such a holistic worldview where created nature is considered a living entity, everything is qualitatively and quantitatively connected to everything else through cosmic sympathies and antipathies. Standing on the uppermost echelon is the wholly transcendental and benevolent God, the Entopan. So Entopan in Greek means the one is all, who ruminates in perfect solitude. Emanating from the One is also a hierarchical order of beings or formative planetary forces that encompass ethereal intelligences and bestow incarnating souls with particular powers or qualities. So, for example, a soul descending through the sphere of Mercury would gain its cunning from there. As it descended through Venus, so the sphere of Venus, it would gain its desire from there. As it descended through the Jovian sphere, that of Jupiter, that's where it got its ambition from, and so forth. So in this way, the macrocosm, the cosmos at large, and the corporeal proto-human, the microcosm, are inextricably linked through a system of correspondences that both reflect and coherently express the divine intellect. Further still, the texts implicate a practical approach to the primeval knowledge, which enabled adherents to either bend nature to their will, accelerate its perfection through chrysopoeia, chrysopoeia in Greek means gold making, or discern time frames decreed by the heavenly arrangement to be auspicious for certain activities like divination. Hermeticism, then, was akin to the Egyptian sacred science from its humble beginnings, philosophia pia, that syncretized theology, philosophy, mysticism, natural science, and medicine with the dignified disciplines of alchemy, astrology, and theurgy, posing an intensely practical and operative approach. The French philosopher André Juan Festugier categorized the heterogeneous texts according to their content, a division which remains valid to this day. On one hand, there were the philosophical Hermetica, or what he termed the philosophical Hermetica, that concerned themselves with philosophical speculation, and on the other hand, there were the technical Hermetica that reinforced philosophical knowledge of God through practical means. Both denominations belong to a curriculum which actively sought regressus ad uterum, a return to the womb, for its postulants, a consciously generated reascension through the seven celestial spheres and reunification with God in the eighth. Alchemy itself, the epitome of operative Hermeticism, seems to have emerged from the Alexandrian marriage of Aristotelian natural science to Gnostic and Egyptian mythology, as well as Neoplatonism. The quintessential entelechia at the heart of the alchemical teleology stems from entopan, as we said, the one is all, the notion that all matter, tangible or intangible, originates from the base substance of the universe, which we've discerned in earlier blogs as the prima materia, the base substance. Only through such a cosmology do outlandish feats of perfecting nature, including the synthesis of the elixir of life or the scintillating ruby-red philosopher's stone, make any sense. According to alchemical doctrine, the qualities of spirit and matter, as well as ether or quintessence and prima materia, stand opposite to one another on the cosmological totem pole. The ether prompts a fourfold differentiation of the latter into the elements of fire, air, water, and earth, all of which are comprised of two secondary qualities. So, for example, fire is dry and hot, air is hot and wet, water is wet and cold, and earth is cold and dry. Each element shares a secondary quality with two others, aligning them into a forward-moving cycle known as elemental rotation, where a succeeding condition is potentially latent in an existing one. This makes possible a realm of endless feasibility. The transmutation of metals, the creation of precious stones, the purification of substances, and of course, dare I say it, the raising of vibrations of all consciousness, which seems to be a very particularly famous or interpretation of alchemy nowadays. The square, born from the circle, or the number 4, which segregates from the 1, is an exoteric expression of the conferral of form from the amorphous base substance. There were 4 ethereal elements and seasons, which of course is nature, and nature is inferior. Then that proceeded from a fourfold celestial arrangement, and of course celestial, by celestial is the empyrean, that's the superior realm. And of course, these two together generated a unique equilibrium of four cardinal humours in the human being. And man, of course, is a reflection of nature and everything above, so he's inferior and superior together, juxtaposed. And of course, the four humours, according to Galenic and Galenic medicine, is phlegm, black gall, yellow gall, and blood. Thus, the correct mixture of elemental corpuscles facilitated the restoration of health and the materialization of gold. And gold, by gold, of course, we could be talking about earthly gold, we could be talking about spiritual gold. There was even a latent chemico-medical formula for life eternal, which of course is the elixir of life, and which formed a primary concern for the Chinese alchemists. By the 2nd century CE, alchemy had emerged in the West as a syncretized mystical and chemical operative art. The life and testaments of an active Pythagorean named Pseudo-Democritus, or Bolus of Mendes, who lived in the Deltaic Egyptian city of Mendes during the 4th century BCE, certainly attests to such. Known for his mystical approach to the artisanal crafts, Bolus wrote a rather lengthy alchemical treatise entitled Physicatia Mystica, physical and mystical matters, of which only segments have survived. What remains of this text reveals deep preoccupation with both the physical and paraphysical. So, Spagheria, a principal concern of the Chinese and later of the Arabian alchemists, is given special prominence in the text. He transcribes the therapeutic and medical competences of many herbs, along with the propensity of some to evoke the voice of the gods and cause psychedelic visions. While eliciting an understanding and awareness of word intonation and breathing techniques in the casting of magical spells, Bolus's treatise delineates a process whereby a base substance, or the prima materia, usually lead or mercury, is used to prepare gold, which is also known as the Great Work or the Philosopher's Stone. In this, the earliest known prototype of metallic transmutation, transformation and exaltation of the stone is marked by 4 distinct phases of coloration that serve as exoteric markers of a deduction process instigated by the laws of cosmic sympathy and antipathy. Thus, the stone, or noble metal, is conferred form only after undergoing putrefaction through melanosis, which is the nigredo, bleaching through leucosis, which is albedo, yellowing through xanthosis, which is citrinitas in Latin, and finally reddening through iosis, which is rubedo. Purple sometimes takes the place of red in the last of these stages, hinting at the spiritual ennoblement bubbling directly beneath a chemical process which at first appears to be little more than the transcription of the coloration and purification of metals. Given that Hermeticism and alchemy foster esoteric monotheism and fiercely resist dogmatic compartmentalization of the divine, one would expect their assimilation by Christianity as a propaedeutic to the first truths revealed in the New Testament to have been a straightforward and harmonious affair. In actual fact, alchemy partakes of the same Aristotelian empirical methodology, which would henceforth entwine itself around Christian dogma to produce a highly resistant strain of middle-aged deductive reasoning known as Aristotelian scholasticism. This is yet another reason why it should have evaded the vehement polemics of the early theologians. Lamentably, the opposite holds true. Writing at the end of the 4th and beginning of the 5th century, the Christian philosopher Augustine of Hippo described the Hermetic Asclepius for its reinforcement of Platonic demonology and theurgic conjuration, which sought to ensorcel spirits into statues for the sake of listening to prayers and granting wishes. So he was very, very against that. For Augustine, Hermes was a pagan sorcerer whose idolatrous ways could not be reconciled with an alternate image of him as the harbinger of God the Son in Jesus Christ. Paramount to early Christian apologetics, these sentiments naturally extended to what the Greeks called hema, the operative art. Tellurian, Clement of Alexandria, and a horde of other apologetical writers were convinced that knowledge of the chemical arts were compiled into books by fallen angels who'd embarked on indecent liaisons with corrupted mortals. Secondly, alchemy's ambition to recapitulate the wonder of the cosmos before the fall ran too close to the heresy of Gnostic revelation, which postulated that original gnosis was lost when the androgynous proto-human ruptured into its male and its female constituents. Adam and Eve, so the female and male constituents, of course, is Adam and Eve. The Gnostic affiliation was the last straw. When Constantine introduced Christianity into the Roman Empire as the official religion, he outlawed Gemma and submitted all texts referencing it to the fate of a giant conflagration. But the art was not extinguished. It subsisted in the progressive Arab world and returned, although in modified and exalted form, through Latin translations of texts made in the late 12th and early 13th centuries in Toledo in Spain. Right up until about the 12th century, the operational knowledge contained in alchemy was faithfully left to the Arabian polymaths, who ascribed it to the tutelage of Her Mistress Majestas. In a lost 9th century frame narrative called Kitab al-Uluf, it is revealed that there were in fact 3 sages called Hermes. The first, an antediluvian ancestor, transcribed the primeval Adamic knowledge onto stela inside the Upper Egyptian temple of Akhmim, which Akhmim is Panopolis in Egypt, and that has been a very important ancient site for the transmission of alchemy through the ancient and Arab world. The second, on the other hand, rediscovered the knowledge for the betterment of humanity, and the third authored a plethora of alchemical treatises. A supernal legitimation legend from the Arabic frame narrative treasure of Alexander the Great tells of a golden book that had been locked into a chest and subsequently smuggled into the walls of a monastery by Antiochus I. Inside the book is a passage intimating that the king of Macedon had been initiated into the Adamic knowledge by the third of these figures, so King Hermes the alchemist. At the prompting of his tutor Aristotle, Alexander had meticulously studied the primeval wisdom through 10 Hermetic volumes composed chiefly of chemico-operative and medical content. The aforementioned treatise was in widespread circulation during the early modern period under the title of Liber de Composition Alchemiae. So that means book on the system of alchemy, having been translated into Latin by Maurianus the Greek. We can be certain of this because the Hermetic legitimation legends based on Alexander the Great were emphatically retold in Prefatio Castrensis, a prefatory note to Maurianus's work written by Robert of Chester, the translator's preface accompanying the Septem Tractus Hermetis, which means 7 tractates of Hermes, as well as the preface to the Liber Hermetis Mercuri Triplicis, de the 6th of the 6 Rerum Principis, which means Book of the Triple Hermes, Mercury on the 6th Principle of Things. Another 9th century legend, this one from Greece proper, reveals that Alexander once had a beautiful sister called a Ward of Honor. At one time, the beloved siblings conspired to steal the elixir of life from a gruesome dragon that lived in the subterranean. They eventually tasted success, but it was short-lived, for Ward of Honor dropped the flask onto the ground whilst fleeing from the fiend and splattered its contents on the ground. Alexander's cussing was so potent that he turned her into a gargantuan mermaid. The character of Alexander the Great as an archetypal world hero held widespread appeal in the Middle Ages, just as Prince Camwas, the 4th son of Ramses the Great, gained a dignified place as the mythologized protagonist of many fables which adhered to the magical demotic literature of Egypt's late period. Alexander's tutor Aristotle was also a very popular subject in the Arabic world, so popular in fact that he was hailed as the author of treatises whose belief systems were incompatible with his empirical methods. Foremost were the Theology of Aristotle and Liber de Causis, texts that conceived of the universe as an interacting realm of physical and paraphysical forces, partly intelligible to revelation. This worldview was closely adhered by the Muslim philosophers Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes. The incessant juxtaposition of alchemical doctrine with Platonic metaphysics in the Arabic interpretation of Hermeticism had a profound effect on the discipline of alchemy, which returned to the Latin West after a marked absence couched in Neoplatonic terminology. By far the most pivotal document regarding the transmission of the Hellenistic and Arabic operative art was the Tabula Smaragdina, or Emerald Tablet, an apocryphal summa of alchemical knowledge set within a philosophical treatise titled Book of the Secrets of Creation. Ascribed to Balinus, the pseudo-Apollonius of Diana, and translated from Arabic into Latin by Hugo von Santala in the late 12th century, this text endeavours to anatomically dissect the cosmological principles which underpin the universe. It explores, among other things, the many names which define the intangible sphere of God and blatantly recapitulates the birth of the cosmos within the context of Aristotle's theories of matter. The etheric bodies or planets of the primum mobile, just below the Empyrean, spur ontological differentiation of the primeval matter into three separate realms. So in the mineral kingdom with its stones and gems, we have the vegetable kingdom with its plants and trees, and the animal kingdom with its dogs and deers, and whatever else. Being a miniature replica of the macrocosm, the human being possessed a very exalted place in this hierarchy, and is particularly susceptible to interlinking forces of mutual attraction known as cosmic sympathies. The latter describes a condition of mutual attraction, correspondence, and fundamental interconnectedness where everything below is caused by and is a debased reflection of everything above. Concluding Balinus's Book of the Secrets of Creation is the enigmatic prose of the Tabula Smaragdina, which offers an abridged summa describing natural processes in the context of intellectu. Emphasis is placed on the dependence of all life on the two celestial luminaries, and fire or heat is implicated as the primal mover and root power of chemical processes like sublimation, dissolution, and calcination. A great many philosophers like Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon attempted to decode this cryptic text in the 13th century with little to no success. The most comprehensive and memorable interpretation, at least the one which encompassed far-reaching consequences for Renaissance alchemy, was given by Hortulanus in the 14th century, who postulated that the vague doctrine alluded to the creation of the philosopher's stone. His perspective graced nearly all early modern publications of the text. I would be remiss not to mention two other Arabic texts that played a crucial role in the highly refurbished version of alchemy that flowed into the early Renaissance. These were the Secreta Secretorum, a 10th century Arabic text that was translated into Latin in about 1120 by John of Seville, and then again in 1232 by Philippus Tripolitanus. And of course we also have the Turba Philosophorum, or what was otherwise known as the Assembly of the Philosophers, a late 13th century Latin translation of a 10th century Arabic text, tentatively titled, or tentatively ascribed to Uthman Suwaid of Akhmim, who lived in the 9th century. The first of these, a spiel on a syncretized occultism, combining alchemical, astrological, and theurgical concepts, is presented within the literary framework of a pseudepigraphical letter from Aristotle to Alexander the Great. Native to the text are select commentaries on the Tabula Smaragdina, an early translation of the latter itself, and a meticulous transcription outlining the process whereby the red stone is brought into existence. The second, the Turba Philosophorum, implicated pre-Socratic and classical philosophers of the caliber of Pythagoras, Socrates, Anaxagoras, Democritus, and Parmenides to have been individual beads forming a theological, philosophical necklace known as the Prisha Theologia that stretched across the sands of time, a concept which would flower and gain widespread acceptance during the early Renaissance with the humanist Marsilio Ficino. More importantly, the text preserved the kernel of the Hellenistic tradition in fragments of Pseudo-Democritus' Physicacia Mystica, without bringing to light innovative concepts laid into the esoteric art by the Arabian polymaths. In the Turba, for instance, synthesis of the elixir or panacea does not mirror the sex act, whereby the sulphurous male and the mercurial female, otherwise stand-ins for sulfur and mercury, are subjected to a sequence of sol et coagula, or dissolutions and coagulations, until the matter in the alembic can jettison all impurity. This dualistic and animistic conception of matter was first described by a contemporary manuscript in the Corpus Jabirianum, a cache of over 500 alchemical texts attributed to the Arab Jabir, who is Jabir Hayyan. It appears that alchemy's intercourse with the empirical and rationalistic outgrowth of the Islamic world melted and reformed its Aristotelian nucleus into something much more exotic and flamboyant. Over and above modification of its practical and exoteric aspects, there was a major shift in its philosophical perspectives. Extending the Aristotelian vision of natural philosophy, the Arab Jabir postulated that the four ethereal elements of the prima materia further differentiate into philosophical sulfur and mercury, or argent vive. The fusion of the latter two crystallized a particular balance of elemental qualities, which created the metals under the aegis of the seven planetary powers. With this came the genesis of the empirical method and quantitative analysis, heeded by chemico-operative alchemists who promptly shifted their attention away from the synthesis of material gold to a far more ambitious endeavor, the preservation of life. Many Arabian polymaths sought to apply their knowledge of chemical processes to manufacture alchemical tinctures and medicines for the restoration of bodily health, giving credence and paving the way for the subsequent emergence of Paracelsian iatrochemia, or iatrochemistry. According to Jabir, these potent medicines could be prepared using base matter from any of the three kingdoms. He also consolidated upon Aristotle's teleology and entertained roads frequently travelled by the romanticism of possibilities in reasoning that if man were indeed a microcosm, then he should in fact possess intrinsic powers enabling him to imitate or recapitulate the natural processes of the macrocosm or cosmos on a smaller scale, perhaps even to artificially manipulate Mander's elemental corpuscles in his hermetically sealed flask. Many Arabian alchemists believed that under auspicious stellar arrangements, achieving chemical equilibrium in animal matter might in fact generate diminutive artificial creatures in their image called homunculi. So creating life, curing ailments, and palingenesis, which is basically the restoration of a plant from its ashes, as well as the prolongation and prevention of human expiry, comprised some elite avant-garde alchemical pursuits that eventually entered mainstream thought. So from the 12th century all the way up to the dawn of the early Renaissance in the 14th, all theologians and philosophers advanced along a theoretical and practical path hewn out by their Hellenistic and Islamic forebears. Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon both conducted extensive research into the chemical processes of the operative art and searched diligently for the panacea, detailing their findings in the publications Libellus de Alchimia and Compendium Philosophiae, respectively. During this period, Thomas Aquinas was of utmost importance to the dignity of the tradition, given that he made feasible attempts to marry the revolutionary experimental method with Christian dogma. With respect to the latter, there were some inroads made by Iberian physician and alchemist Arnold of Villanova, who juxtaposed necrosis, which is the nigredo phase, a stage in which matter in the retort or alembic blackens and putrefies, with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. In layman's terms, Arnold was alluding to the passion of Christ as exemplar par excellence of solve et coagula, or the dismemberment and creation of a new unity between the ethereal elements. Attributed to this personage is also the idea of a coveted vital life principle, otherwise known as an essence or a quintessence, for all that exists that can allegedly be isolated through chemical processes like infusion, distillation, and maceration. This notion was enchanting and novel to Renaissance thought, inspiring 14th century Franciscan monk Johannes de Rupesissa, who related his lifelong quest for it in a treatise entitled De Consideration Quinta. The all-encompassing tenet infused Renaissance alchemy with an unprecedented poise and remains anchored to the collective subconscious until this day, most notably in the spagirical method of Dr. Albert Richard Riedel, or Frater Albertus, as he was more commonly known. Changes to the cultural and intellectual climate of early modern Europe wrought by the Renaissance were not uniform, yet scholars have established invisible markers to draw a definitive distinction between the former and the late Middle Ages, the way distinctive borders on a political map may anatomically divide two countries. Three main developments in the 14th century symbolized the passage from one era to the next. The first was Johannes Gutenberg's invention of the printing press, which fundamentally enabled translations of Hellenistic, Arabic, and Latin texts from all disciplines to transcend the niche monastic circles to which they were usually conferred, and achieve a much wider distribution. In this way, they would become far more influential. The second is inextricably linked with the fall of Constantinople in 1453, a lamentable collapse that saw the many Byzantine scholars desert their posts and move to Western Europe, and particularly Florence. One might say that the seed of transformation was carried there in the form of a Greek manuscript titled Corpus Hermeticum by a monk named Leonardo de Pistoia. Translated into Tuscan Italian by the scholar Marsilio Ficino, the philosophical theological cosmology underpinned by the first 14 treatises that comprise this Hermetic text added considerable weight to the ammunition for a system of thought that was in vehement polemization against Aristotelian scholasticism. It enabled a conduit for esotericism to enter mainstream thought and served as the light source for the flowering of the 16th century Reformation that saw the emergence of what would become contemporary science. The third was a byproduct of the intellectual re-emergence of classical sources. Ficino's translations of the Corpus Hermeticum, so the Platonic dialogues, the Orphic hymns, and quite a few other Neoplatonic texts, made gel the diffusionist ideology of Renaissance humanism, so the Philosophia Perennis, or Prisca Theologia, which treated Hermes Trismegistus as one of its sages and the Christian revelation its final cause and culmination. Without a doubt, the induction of man or microcosm into the prestigious and opulent cosmic hall of fame as Hermetic Archmagus to the transcendental God would have seduced the Renaissance humanists. The promotion can be traced to Neoplatonic ontology, which blatantly asserts that the realms above the sublunary and below the empyrean, so in other words the sphere of the fixed stars, the prime mobile with the 7 planets, were all subject to transitory states and the condition of becoming. Their newfound accessibility to intermediary spheres that adjudicate over the inferior world of generation explicitly empowered humans with the ability to manipulate natural processes through a system of correspondences. Hence, together with dignity, the reawakening of active imagination, willpower, reprise, and mystical extravagance, the Neoplatonic vision gave back to humanity part of the original inheritance and glory hinted at by Alexandrian alchemy. In themselves, plants, trees, minerals, stones, and animals were little more than elemental corpuscles of detritus and dust, an amalgamation of the 4 elements revealed through the key qualities of hot, cold, dry, and moist, in addition to secondary ones like soft, hard, sweet, and sour. What spirited them to life was an auric, ethereal, and occult web of vital life force that derived from the stars and was qualitative in nature. Known as the anima mundi, or world soul, this intangible energy infused itself into created matter and adhered intrinsically to the anatomical features of each object or substance. In addition, it inveigled the spiritus mundi, or world spirit, and the material realm, the corpus mundi, or world body, into an indissoluble cosmic triangle, not only mediating between them, but conferring form upon the latter. Ficino's treatise De Vita Coelitus Comparanda reconciled Aristotle's theory of matter with Platonic metaphysics by implicating that the spiritus mundi and the alchemical quintessence, or vital life force, described by both Arnold of Villanova and Johannes de Rupecissa, to be one and the same entity. Agrippa of Nettesheim faithfully added to and cultivated Ficino's promising innovation, painting the elements in an alchemical light and further asserting that the endeavour of natural magic was precariously hinged on understanding the threefold anatomical structure of the elements. In his De Occulta Philosophia, he reasoned that the unknowable and ubiquitous essence of the anima mundi manifested in 5 different hypostases, so in the 4 Aristotelian elements, as well as the 5th, which was known as the quintessence. In the mineral realm, it worked through ethereal earth to garner expression through mathematical principles, whilst in plants and trees it manifested in the associative kingdom's formative force under the aegis of ethereal water. Alternatively, it morphed into ethereal air to express itself as the carnal drive of all animals and spontaneously toiled through ethereal fire as the torch of human reason. So it was something different in each realm. In the first 4 hypostases, the anima mundi acted as a universal curative or panacea, but in its 5th and purest form, otherwise known as ether or spirit, it attained full expression as a formative force to be reckoned with. Here it became spiritus mundi, or the philosopher's stone, a power able to attract and influence the planetary intelligences, transmutate metals, and create or recreate corporeal life. 16th and 17th century interpretations of the Tabula Smaragdina as a cryptic and hallowed ode to the world soul attest the popularity of the cosmological revelation. Comprised of an unruly union between Neoplatonic and Aristotelian ontology, this newborn hybrid of Renaissance alchemy remained deeply embedded in holism and fixated on understanding the inner regularity of all created forms. These philosophical premises were to go on to dominate the 16th and 17th century outlook of Hermetic philosophy. One would not be unjust in claiming that the climactic moment, or apotheosis, of this syncretic alchemy finally came with Paracelsus of Hohenheim, a man who harmonized with the cosmological footprints impressed upon the rapidly crystallizing alchemical clay by Marsilio Ficino and Agrippa. Adhering to conventional alchemical thought and terminology, Paracelsus believed in the causal differentiation of the prima materia into the elements of spirit, soul, and body, and the quintessence or panacea which interpenetrated and hypostasized itself within nature's threefold kingdom in ultimate states. These he assimilated into his chemico-medical interpretation of the world under the designations sulfur, mercury, and salt, as well as archeus for the latter. Like all progressive minds, Paracelsus was inclined to view the cosmos as a byproduct of large-scale operations carried out by the supernal being of God. But God wasn't just any alchemist. He was the alchemist, who unraveled creation ex deo by distilling the agglomeration of chaos in his alembic, over and over, until the gold of consciousness had been set free. Every substance, every particle of matter that existed represented a particular stage in his cycle of distillations. Just like Agrippa, Paracelsus also agreed that the anatomy of the universe, the meaningful connections between objects or substances, as well as their fundamental makeup had to be understood before one could exact a cure for a disease or simply spark knee-jerk reaction on nature's part. Of course, the key to unlocking nature's cryptic hieroglyphs, Paracelsus argued, lay in the correct interpretation of individual signatures or occult virtues that originated from the cupola of the heavens and pertain to each corporeal object or substance. Knowing the occult property of each one enabled the Hermeticist to directly affect others which lay in its direct path of sympathetic correspondence. Let's proceed with an example. If Paracelsus was alive today, he'd interpret the Kava Kava root's ability to induce euphoria and psychedelic visions as tangible proof of its subordination to the generative forces of the lunar sphere. Hence, rendered into a tincture of sorts, it would make a potent remedy for an ailing organ ruled by that planetary power, which of course in this case happens to be the brain. A true testament to his ingenuity was a spagirical-based method of fabricating metal-based detoxified drugs and homeopathic tonics to basically correct chemical imbalances caused by celestially derived parasites and poisons. These practical developments were made from theoretical premises that causally linked the well-being and auric life force of the body's anatomical features to the vacillating energies of planetary intelligences. A Paracelsian stance which completely rejected the highly resistant strain of Hippocratic and Galenic medicine based on a disproportion of the four humours and temperaments. From this perspective, the chemical composition of the microcosm was, so to speak, a corporeal reflection of energetic temperaments emanating from the planetary spheres. So, in hindsight, what we have with Paracelsus is a man with one leg planted in the early paradigm of empirical science with its objective methodology, and the other firmly entrenched in a spiritual world pervaded by hidden intelligences. The latter, soon to be confined to the occult dustbin as an eclectic eccentricity of the criminally insane, dictated Paracelsian reasoning to a substantial degree. With respect to the synthesis and administration of antidotes, for instance, Paracelsus monitored the astrological movement. Planetary conjunctions, oppositions, or eclipses involving those celestial bodies ascribed rulership over plants or metals intended for use had to be monitored, for certain times and arrangements were more likely to garner potency for a herbal elixir than others. Therefore, timing, a qualitative measure under Rugsford by mechanistic analysis, was of everything to the endeavour. Paracelsus's panentheistic cosmogony was based on an unwavering intercourse of subtle energies between the planets, the human body, and the anatomical parts of nature herself for the sake of equilibrium, forcing three distinct disciplines, which were astrology, medicine, and alchemy, which had existed in symbiotic enantiodromia, which is a Greek word, which basically means that two fields or operational fields from one particular field of inquiry have been progressing together, started from a common source and progressed together during the Middle Ages to finally conjunct. So basically astrology, medicine, and alchemy in Paracelsian thought conjuncted. The philosophical and speculative contributions bestowed upon Renaissance thought by alchemy were not novel, for they had subsisted and survived in variant forms during the Middle Ages, and here we'll proceed with a small recapitulation of everything that we've learned today. In fact, a full-fledged mystical and chemical operative alchemy had arisen from the Alexandrian marriage of Aristotelian natural philosophy to Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, and aspects of Egyptian mythology as early as the 2nd century BCE. Built upon a solid theoretical framework, its practical objectives encompassed everything from chrysopoeia and argyropoeia, which means gold making and silver making, to spagyrics, dealing with plants, and this fabrication of precious stones. Lamentably, the coming of the Christian dispensation scattered the technical art from the Latin West. Christianity's foremost theologian of the time, Augustine, painted a heretical picture of Hermes as a pantheistic sorcerer, and his teachings the inspiration of demons. Consequently, Khema was guilty by association. Remarkably, the 7th and 8th centuries were something of a godsend, for they enabled the tradition to continue to evolve under a more progressive Islamic milieu. Islamic polymaths of the caliber of Jabir, Razes, and Avicenna pioneered chemical operative methods, inventing a crude form of the contemporary scientific method and extending theoretical premises to include the mercury-sulfur theory, a dualistic interpretation of matter, as well as the search for a universal elixir which hypothesized in 3 states. For the Arabs, Hermes wasn't a god or a demigod, he was a magician whose alchemical secrets had been discovered by Alexander the Great at the prompting of Aristotle, his tutor. During this time, many pseudepigraphical Arabic writings attributed to the latter were in wide circulation, with a vast majority inveigling alchemical doctrine into the occult cosmogony and subsequently dressing it in Neoplatonic terminology. The transcription of a great number of these Arabic manuscripts into Latin by the Toledo School of Translators during the 12th century ensured the operative art returned to the Christian West wholly dignified and wholly reformed. So between the 12th and 14th centuries, the philosophers and theologians practicing the art remained faithful to the theoretical premises made by its Arabic and Hellenistic forerunners, whilst concurrently adhering to the socio-political and religious conventions of the Middle Ages. Albertus Magnus and Robert Bacon explored transmutation and the philosopher's stone from a purely mechanistic perspective to avoid attracting the enmity of the Church. Thomas Aquinas was also an avid believer in transmutation and wished to harmonize it with the Christian faith, although it wasn't until Arnold of Villanova that theoretical inroads were finally made. Arnold not only equated the alchemical stage of necrosis, which is nigredo, with Jesus' crucifixion, but developed the idea of a vital life force for each substance or object that could be separated through chemical distillation. This novel train of thought would become the lifelong obsession of Johannes de Ripicissa and an alchemical overture during the Renaissance. An unlikely union between the Aristotelian theory of matter and Platonic metaphysics inspired the philosopher Hortulanus, who garnered an enduring 14th century interpretation of the Tabula Smaragdina as an allegorical exposition of the philosopher's stone. 2 separate alchemical perspectives then met in Ficino and Agrippa, who had added another twist to operative hermeneutics by causally overlapping the Platonic world soul with Villanova's vital force. The overarching take of the aforementioned scholars was so popular that it supplanted Hortulanus' version and dominated alchemical esotericism until the end of the 17th century. Greatly inspired by this syncretized holism bent on understanding the inner regularity of created forms, Paracelsus developed his paradigm of iatrochemia, or iatrochemistry, the homeopathic approach to medicine. At the time, the ultimate fate of alchemy and its doctrines was integration into the sacred science of Renaissance man, the new Adam. This multi-eyed microcosm, with each lens tuned to a different occupation, so Hermetic archmagus, physician, mystic, philosopher, alchemist, and astrologer, enabled him to bend nature, to coerce and correct it, to align it to the imarmeni, a Greek word which roughly equates to fate, or even pervert it. Regardless, the jack-of-all-trades approach gave him the Midas touch. Officially divine at last. And with that, on that note, we end today's lesson, and I will see you next time. Have a good one.